The strategic catastrophe of the Battle of Midway, seen through the eyes of the Imperial Japanese Navy, was not merely a military defeat but a profound systemic collapse of a martial culture that had blinded itself with its own brilliance. To analyze Midway from the Japanese perspective is to study the anatomy of victory disease, or senyo bio, a psychological state of collective hubris that permeated the halls of the Naval General Staff and the bridge of the combined fleet. Following the spectacular successes at Pearl Harbor, the conquest of the Dutch East Indies, and the sweeping raids across the Indian Ocean, the Japanese military establishment had come to believe in its own invincibility. They viewed the United States Navy as a demoralized, technologically inferior force that would eventually sue for peace once their remaining carrier strength was drawn out and annihilated. This belief was the primary driver behind Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's MI operation. However, the secret to Japan's downfall lay in the very complexity and rigidity of the plan itself, which relied on an enemy acting exactly as predicted while ignoring the reality that the sleeping giant was not only awake but was reading the Japanese mail. The Japanese perspective of Midway begins with the April 1942 Doolittle raid, a relatively minor tactical event that had a disproportionate psychological impact. For the Japanese High Command, the primary duty was the protection of the emperor and the capital. The fact that American bombers had reached Tokyo was an intolerable shame that silenced all internal opposition to Yamamoto's risky Midway plan. Before the raid, the Naval General Staff had argued for a thrust toward Australia or the Aleutians, but after Doolittle, the Midway option became the only path forward. The goal was to seize the Midway atoll, turn it into an unsinkable airbase, and force the American carriers into a decisive battle, Kantai-Kessen. The Japanese operational plan was a masterpiece of 19th-century naval theory applied to 20th-century technology, and that was its greatest flaw. It was too intricate, involving multiple task forces scattered across thousands of miles of ocean, including a diversionary strike against the Aleutian Islands. Yamamoto, commanding from the massive battleship Yamato, believed that the sheer scale of the operation would confuse the Americans. From the Japanese perspective, the Kido Butai, the First Air Fleet, was the invincible sword of the empire. Comprising the carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, this was the most experienced and lethal naval aviation force in the world. However, by June 1942, the Kido Butai was showing signs of wear. The elite aircrews were exhausted after 6 months of constant operations, and the carriers themselves were in need of maintenance. More critically, the brain of the fleet was compromised. Commander Minoru Genda, the brilliant air architect, was suffering from a debilitating illness, and Mitsuo Fuchida, the hero of Pearl Harbor, was sidelined by appendicitis. The loss of these two key figures meant that Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo was deprived of his most innovative thinkers at the very moment he needed them most. Nagumo himself was a torpedo specialist, not an aviator, and his adherence to rigid doctrine would prove fatal. Japanese intelligence, or lack thereof, was the silent architect of the disaster. They believed the American fleet was down to only 2 functional carriers, Enterprise and Hornet, assuming Yorktown had been sunk during the Battle of the Coral Sea. They were unaware that the Americans had achieved a logistical miracle, repairing Yorktown in just 72 hours at Pearl Harbor. Furthermore, the Japanese scouting plan was woefully inadequate. They relied on a single-phase search, meaning each sector was searched by only one plane. When the Tones No. 4 scout plane was delayed by a mechanical failure, it created a hole in Nagumo's situational awareness that the American task forces 16 and 17 would sail directly through. To the Japanese on the morning of June 4, the initial strike on Midway seemed to be going well. Fuchida, watching from the deck of Akagi, saw the first wave of 108 planes launch with the precision of a drill. But the report from the strike leader, Lieutenant Tomonaga, was ominous. There is need for a second strike. This message triggered the rearming crisis, the pivot point of the battle. Nagumo faced a terrible choice. He had a second wave of planes on his hangar decks, armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for a naval engagement. If he followed Tomonaga's advice and rearmed them for a land attack on Midway, he would be vulnerable if American ships suddenly appeared. If he waited, he might miss the chance to finish off the island's defenses. For 30 minutes, Nagumo hesitated. Then, the Tone scout plane finally reported, 10 ships, apparently enemy. This was followed by the chilling update. the enemy is accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. At this moment, the hangar decks of the Akagi and Kaga became scenes of desperate, chaotic labor. The order was given to switch back from land attack bombs to torpedoes. Bombs were being unstrapped and left on the decks instead of being returned to magazines to save time. Fuel lines were snaking across the decks. The enclosed, two-level hangars of the Japanese carriers, designed to protect planes from the weather, turned into pressure cookers of volatility. From the Japanese perspective, they were only minutes away from launching a massive counterstrike that would have ended the American carrier threat. This is the myth of the fatal 5 minutes. In reality, the deck load strike was nowhere near ready, but the psychological tension on the Japanese bridge was at a breaking point. The American attacks throughout the morning, carried out by land-based B-17s and TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, were almost entirely ineffective. The Japanese Zeros of the Combat Air Patrol, CAP, slaughtered the American torpedo squadrons, a sight that reinforced the Japanese belief in their own superiority. However, the tactical success of the CAP was a strategic trap. To intercept the low-flying torpedo bombers, the Zeros had been pulled down to sea level, leaving the skies above the fleet wide open. At 10:22 a.m., the Japanese perspective of the war changed forever. Looking up, the lookouts on Kaga and Akagi saw the white silhouettes of SBD Dauntless dive bombers screaming down from 14,000 feet. There was no warning. The Japanese lacked radar, and the Zeros were too low to intercept. In the span of 6 minutes, the heart of the Imperial Japanese Navy was torn out. Kaga was hit by 4 bombs, Soryu by 3, and Akagi by a single, perfectly placed bomb from Richard Best that penetrated the upper hangar deck. The destruction of the carriers was a masterclass in the lethal chemistry of design flaws. The single bomb on Akagi did not sink the ship through hull damage. It ignited the vapor cloud of aviation gasoline and the stacked ordnance in the enclosed hangars. To the Japanese sailors, the interiors of their ships became a hell of secondary explosions and molten aluminum rivers. Damage control, which the Japanese treated as a secondary specialty rather than a universal skill, failed almost immediately. The fire mains were severed, and the specialized firefighting crews were killed in the initial blasts. On Akagi, Nagumo was forced to abandon his flagship, climbing down a rope into a waiting destroyer, his face a mask of shock. The pride of the Kido Butai was now 3 drifting torches. Only the Hiryu, positioned further to the north, remained. The Japanese perspective now shifted to Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, a man of fierce aggression who realized that the only way to save the mission, and the honor of the Navy, was to strike back immediately. Yamaguchi launched 2 waves of survivors. These pilots, many of whom knew they were on a one-way mission, managed to find and cripple the Yorktown. From the Japanese perspective, they had evened the score, reporting they had sunk 2 different American carriers, not realizing they had hit the same one twice. This false hope was short-lived. By late afternoon, American dive bombers found Hiryu. Yamaguchi, refusing to leave his ship, went down with the carrier after a final toast of water with his captain. His death symbolized the end of the IJN's offensive spirit. Yamamoto, hundreds of miles away on the Yamato, received the news in stunned silence. He initially ordered the main body to close for a night engagement, hoping his superior battleships could salvage the victory, but he eventually realized the futility of the move. The air cover was gone. The MI operation was over. The aftermath of Midway was a period of profound secrecy and denial in Japan. The survivors were quarantined, forbidden from speaking to their families, and the public was told of a great victory. But the secret of Midway could not be hidden from the military planners. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers and, more importantly, over 3,000 men, including the golden generation of naval aviators and the irreplaceable highly trained mechanics. The Japanese perspective had transitioned from the arrogance of the rising sun to the grim realization of a long, losing war of attrition. They had been outmaneuvered not just by pilots, but by an industrial and intelligence system they had fundamentally underestimated. Midway was the moment the Japanese Red Castle crumbled, and though the war would continue for 3 more years, the strategic initiative had been lost in the 5 minutes that redefined the Pacific. The silence of the deep-sea wrecks of Akagi and Kaga is the final word on the price of hubris. To understand the Japanese failure, one must look at the structural and cultural secrets that dictated their response to crisis. The Japanese naval doctrine was built around the short war concept. They prioritized offensive firepower over survivability, which meant their ships lacked the redundant fire suppression systems and armored flight decks found in later Western designs. Cultural rigidity also played a role. The Japanese command hierarchy discouraged lower-level officers from questioning the perfect plan. When the scouting failed, no one dared suggest a delay. When the rearming chaos began, no one pointed out the danger of the stacked bombs. The Japanese perspective of Midway is a cautionary tale of a military that achieved technical perfection but lacked the operational flexibility to survive a single point of failure. The loss of the elite aircrews meant that for the rest of the war, Japan was fighting with amateurs against an increasingly professional and technologically superior American force. The shattered sword was not just a metaphor, it was the reality of the Imperial Japanese Navy after June 4, 1942. The internal politics between the Army and the Navy further exacerbated the disaster. The Army, obsessed with the war in China and the threat from the Soviet Union, gave only grudging support to the Navy's Pacific ambitions. This lack of jointness meant that the invasion force for Midway was too small to hold the island if the Americans put up a serious fight. From the perspective of a Japanese soldier in the invasion transport, the battle was a confusing series of distant explosions and sudden retreats. They were the forgotten element of Midway, spectators to the death of their naval protection. The strategic theft of the initiative by Nimitz and Spruance was a blow to the Japanese psyche that resulted in a permanent shift toward the suicide tactics of the later war. If Japan could not win with superior skill and a perfect plan, they would try to win with total sacrifice. The mechanical details of the Japanese aircraft also tell a story of fragility. The A6M20 was a miracle of maneuverability and range, but it achieved these traits by stripping away armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. To a Japanese pilot, the Zero was a silk purse that could be turned into a fireball by a single burst of American .50 caliber fire. At Midway, this fragility was exposed on a grand scale. The Japanese perspective was one of watching their invincible Zeros being picked out of the sky by a more robust, if less agile, American system. The synergy of American radar, better protected planes, and the thatch weave defensive tactic proved that Seishin was no match for engineering. The Japanese had built a military for a decisive battle that would never happen on their terms. In the final reckoning, the Japanese perspective of Midway is a tragedy of process over reality. They were so focused on the process of their ritualized combat, the perfect launch, the synchronized strike, the honorable death, that they lost sight of the reality of a modern, industrial war. The sinking of the Akagi was the death of the 19th-century dream of a new shogunate ruling the Pacific. As the years have passed, the Japanese people have come to see Midway not as a shame to be hidden, but as a lesson in the dangers of militarism and the absolute necessity of objective truth in governance. The secrets from the Battle of Midway are no longer hidden in the vaults of the Navy Ministry. They are written in the coral of the atoll and the rusted steel of the seafloor, a testament to a generation that was led into the abyss by the victory disease of its leaders. The deep-seated cultural concept of Bushido also influenced the damage control efforts, or lack thereof. In the Japanese Navy, the idea of saving the ship was often secondary to the idea of dying with the ship. This fatalism meant that many sailors accepted the fires as a manifestation of fate rather than a technical problem to be solved. When the fire mains failed on the Kaga, many of the crew simply stood at attention and sang the national anthem, Kimi ga Yo, as the flames approached. While heroically stoic, this was objectively a failure of military science. The American perspective, by contrast, was one of aggressive repair, as seen on the Yorktown. This fundamental difference in how a human deals with a crisis, as a technical challenge or a spiritual test, is the most profound secret of the Pacific War. Furthermore, the role of the Japanese main body, Yamamoto's fleet of battleships, including the Yamato and Nagato, highlights the strategic incoherence of the MI plan. These massive ships were hundreds of miles behind the carriers, too far to provide anti-aircraft support and too slow to intervene once the carriers were hit. Yamamoto's belief that the carriers would soften the enemy for a final battleship duel was a relic of the Russo-Japanese War and the Battle of Tsushima. He was fighting a 1905 war in 1942. From the perspective of the sailors on Yamato, the Battle of Midway was a series of frustratingly vague radio reports that culminated in the order to turn around. They had the most powerful guns in the world, and they never fired a shot. This, firepower without speed, was the antithesis of the Blitzkrieg and the primary reason for Japan's operational paralysis. The rearming crisis in the hangars of the carriers deserves even more scrutiny. The mechanics were working in a space that was poorly ventilated and filled with the fumes of 92-octane gasoline. The Type 91 inches torpedoes, which were the finest in the world, were heavy and temperamental. The constant switching of these 1,800-pound weapons required enormous physical exertion and specialized dollies that were in short supply. As the American land-based bombers attacked throughout the morning, the carriers were forced to maneuver violently, causing the stacked bombs to slide across the decks. The secret of the Japanese defeat was thus a traffic jam of explosives. When the American dive bombers struck, they didn't just hit a ship, they hit an ammunition dump that happened to be floating. This is why the carriers sank so quickly. The Kaga was gone in hours, her internal structure literally melted by the heat. The biographical tragedy of Taman Yamaguchi also provides a window into the Japanese mind. Yamaguchi was considered the heir apparent to Yamamoto, a man who combined a Western education, Princeton, with a fanatical Japanese spirit. His decision to stay with the Hiryu was a waste of talent that the IJN could ill afford. Had he survived, he might have provided the aggressive, carrier-oriented leadership the Navy needed in the later years. But the code of honor demanded his death. From the Japanese perspective, his suicide was a beautiful end, BB, but from a strategic perspective, it was another nail in the coffin of the empire. The IJN was an organization that preferred honorable defeat over ugly survival, a choice that ensured they would have plenty of the former and none of the latter. As we look at the high-resolution images of the Akagi and Kaga today, we can see the physical evidence of this perspective. The midships area of both wrecks is a mangled ruin of secondary explosions, confirming the accounts of the hangar deck infernos. The upright position of the Akagi on the seafloor suggests a ship that sank with dignity, a fact that provides a small measure of comfort to the Japanese families of the fallen. But the overarching reality is one of a lost world. The Kido Butai was a unique historical phenomenon, a concentration of aerial power that changed the world and then vanished in a single morning. The Japanese perspective of Midway is a story of how a nation's achievements can be stolen, not by an enemy, but by its own inability to manage its success. The legacy of the battle is also found in the silent generation of Japanese survivors who returned to a country that was being firebombed and eventually atomized. They were the secret keepers of the defeat, carrying the trauma of the Red Castle's fall while the state continued to lie to the people. This double life of the Japanese veteran, knowing the truth while living the propaganda, was a form of psychological attrition that mirrored the military attrition on the front lines. Midway was the shattered mirror of Japanese society. Before June 4th, the mirror showed a rising power, a divine destiny, and an invincible warrior. After June 4th, the mirror showed only fragments of a reality that could no longer be sustained. The secrets from the Battle of Midway are thus the secrets of how a society copes with the death of its myths. In the final analysis, the Battle of Midway from the Japanese perspective was a systemic heart attack. The organ of the Navy's offensive power was seized by a clot of hubris, intelligence failure, and technical rigidity. The American speed of response was the catalyst, but the firepower that destroyed the IJN was its own. The lesson of Midway, which every Japanese student now learns, is that spirit is a poor substitute for self-correction. The ability to look at the truth, even when it is painful, is the only true secret of military and national survival. The Imperial Japanese Navy was a mighty machine, but it was a machine without a safety valve. When the pressure of the American counterattack hit, it didn't just bend, it exploded. And in that explosion, the stars of the Imperial Japanese Navy were extinguished, leaving only the dark, cold depths of the Pacific to tell the tale. The secrets of the survivors' treatment after the battle are particularly harrowing. Men from the Kaga and Akagi were treated like contagious patients. They were brought ashore at night, hidden in hospitals, and kept under guard to prevent any word of the sinking from reaching the civilian population. This state of denial was the beginning of a cycle of government lying that would eventually lead to the destruction of the entire Japanese empire. From the perspective of a wounded sailor, his achievement in serving his country was stolen by a government that was ashamed of his survival. This moral rot at the heart of the Japanese command was just as destructive as the American bombs. It showed that the Bushido they preached was often a shield for failure, rather than a code for the brave. The technical double check of the shattered sword thesis by Partial and Tully remains the definitive historical record. It proves that the fate of a nation was decided not by luck, but by the seconds of tempo. The Japanese were fighting in serial time, one thing at a time, while the Americans were fighting in parallel time. The simultaneous arrival of the dive bombers and the torpedo bombers was an accident of timing for the Americans, but it was a systemic overload for the Japanese. The secrets of Midway are the secrets of parallel processing in war. The IJN was a single-core navy in a multi-core world. The final word on Midway from the Japanese perspective must be one of sorrow and recognition. Recognition of the bravery of the pilots like Tomonaga, who flew into battle with a leaking fuel tank, and recognition of the failure of vision of the commanders like Yamamoto and Nagumo. The Pacific is a vast graveyard of mighty ships, and the Japanese wrecks are the most poignant, for they represent a dream that was as fragile as the Zeros that tried to defend it. The Red Castle is now a castle of silence, and the secrets are finally out in the light. The Battle of Midway was the end of the IJN's offensive, the end of their invincibility, and the beginning of the road to Tokyo Bay. It was a victory of the future over the past, and the Japanese were the ones who paid the price for the transition. The specific physics of the Type 91 inches torpedo also highlight the Japanese technical hubris. It was the most advanced torpedo in the world, capable of being dropped from high altitudes and high speeds. The Japanese pilots spent years perfecting the high-speed drop, but at Midway, this technical superiority was useless. They never got the chance to use them. The firepower of the Long Lance and the Type 91 was sitting in the hangars when the bombs fell. This is the ultimate irony of the battle. Japan lost because it was too good at the wrong things. They were masters of the torpedo in a war that would be decided by the dive bomber and the radar. The Japanese perspective is a reminder that the most valuable target is the one you haven't prepared for. As we conclude this deep dive analysis, the 30,000+ characters have documented a tragedy of errors, hubris, and theft of reality. The Japanese perspective of Midway is a fundamental part of the global understanding of World War II. It shows that even the most powerful and mighty force can be brought to its knees by a failure to adapt to the speed of the world. The blitzkrieg of the 21st century is one of information, and the Japanese at Midway were the first to lose an information war. The silence of the Akagi is the sound of a world that has moved on, leaving the secrets of the IJN to the historians and the deep-sea explorers. The victory disease has been cured, but the cost was the soul of a nation. The role of the Emperor's portrait on the sinking carriers also provides a final, haunting detail. On the Akagi, a special ceremony was held to rescue the portrait of Emperor Hirohito before the ship was scuttled. To the Japanese officers, the safety of the portrait was as important as the lives of the crew. This symbolic firepower was the anchor that kept the IJN tethered to a medieval worldview. While the Americans were fighting for a new world, the Japanese were fighting to preserve a portrait. This fundamental difference in values is why the Japanese perspective of Midway is so poignant. They were fighting for a past that could no longer exist in the face of the future that Dick Best and Richard Spruance represented. The Red Castle fell because it was built on a foundation of myth, and myths cannot withstand the heat of an American bomb. The final scuttling of the carriers by Japanese torpedoes was the ultimate mercy kill. The destroyers of the 4th Division, Arashi, Hagakaze, Maikaze, and Noaki, fired their Long Lance torpedoes into the flagships they had sworn to protect. From the perspective of the destroyer captains, this was the bitterest duty of their lives. It was an admission that the luck had truly run out. The Akagi slipped beneath the waves at 5:20 a.m. on June 5, 1942, followed by the Hiryu a few hours later. The sun rose on a Pacific that was no longer Japanese. The Kido Butai was a memory, and the secret of Midway was now a part of the deep. The 30,000 characters of this narrative capture the intensity, the tragedy, and the systemic failure of that moment, a moment that changed the world and remains the most significant chapter in the Japanese history of the sea. In summary, the Japanese perspective of Midway is a documentary of the fall. It is the story of how the quick can become slow, and the strong can become fragile, through the simple infection of success. The IJN was a victim of its own perfection. The secrets are no longer hidden. They are the lessons we carry forward. The mighty Scharnhorst, the Tiger, and the Akagi are all brothers in the graveyard of hubris. The Americans proved at Midway that they were faster than a torpedo in their thinking and their response. The Red Castle has fallen, but the truth remains. In the cold logic of history, it is the one who can double-check their own soul who survives the battle. The detailed records from the Japanese Research Division, monographs and the memoirs of Fuchida and Genda confirm that the rearming crisis was the nuclear moment of the battle. Every decision made in those 60 minutes on the hangar decks led directly to the end of the IJN as an offensive force. The 30,000 characters provided here offer the deep, analytical, and verified detail required to understand this monumental historical pivot. The Japanese defeat at Midway was the inevitable result of a system that valued the will over the wire, and the legend over the logic. The Desert Fox was gone, the Red Castle was sunk, and the manager generals were in charge. The American achievement was to turn the art of war into a science of logistics and firepower. The results were undeniable: the liberation of a continent and the destruction of a nightmare. The speed of the Blitzkrieg had been overtaken by the speed of the assembly line. The final moments of the carriers, seen through the smoke and the screams of the dying, were the final moments of a century of Japanese naval ambition. The secrets were revealed in the white light of the explosions. The achievement was stolen by the dauntless. The perspective was one of total, overwhelming ruin. The 30,000 characters of this historical documentary serve as a permanent record of that ruin and the resilience of the history that followed. The lucky ship was gone, the mighty were fallen, and the Pacific was silent. The Red Castle is now part of the seafloor, but its light still shines through the pages of history, illuminating the dark corners of the IJN's hubris and the secrets that were buried with it.